I never thought a single moment could shatter everything I believed about myself. But here I was, caught in a web of emotions I didn't even realize existed. It started so innocently, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. It was an ordinary morning, and my husband, Mike, had already left for work, leaving behind the usual silence that filled our home. After 15 years of marriage, conversations had turned into routine exchanges, bills, errands, schedules. We hardly noticed each other anymore, let alone touched. But that day felt different. I stood in front of the mirror wearing a new dress I had ordered online. It hugged my body in ways that made me feel something I hadn't felt in years, desirable. I couldn't explain why I even bought it. Maybe it was boredom, maybe desperation. That's when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened the door, there he was, Jake, my husband's best friend. Tall, fit, and with a smile that always seemed a little too charming. "Hey, Emma," he said, his eyes scanning me for just a second too long. "Mike asked me to pick up the tools he left in the garage." "Sure," I replied, pulling my robe a little tighter, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt. "Come in." As he stepped inside, I couldn't help but notice how the space seemed smaller with him in it. His scent, masculine and fresh, filled the air, making it impossible to ignore the tension. Jake followed me to the garage, but the way his eyes lingered on me made my pulse quicken. Was it just my imagination, or was he looking at me differently? When I bent down to grab the toolbox, I felt his presence behind me. Close, too close. My breath hitched as his hand brushed against mine, lingering longer than necessary. I froze. "Sorry," he said, his voice low and husky. But the way his fingers grazed mine again as he took the toolbox said otherwise. I knew this was dangerous. I knew it was wrong. But in that moment, I didn't pull away. If you want to know what happens next, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment, an accident. But the way Jake looked at me as he carried the toolbox out to his truck lingered in my mind long after he was gone. I tried to shake it off, focusing on chores and errands, but my thoughts kept drifting back to his touch. It wasn't just the physical contact, it was the heat that came with it, the kind that left my skin tingling and my breath uneven. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Jake. "Thanks for letting me drop by. It was nice seeing you, Emma." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I shouldn't reply. I knew that, but my fingers moved on their own. "Anytime. Glad I could help." His response came almost instantly. "You looked really nice today. Mike's a lucky guy. I should have stopped it there. I should have ignored it. But instead, I felt a rush, validation I hadn't felt in years. Thanks. That's sweet of you." I hated how much I liked his attention. It made me feel guilty, but at the same time, I couldn't stop myself. The next day, Jake showed up again, this time with coffee. "Thought you could use a break," he said, handing me the cup. I hesitated but let him inside. We sat at the kitchen table, talking about everything and nothing. He made me laugh, really laugh, and I couldn't remember the last time I felt so at ease. But then something shifted. As I reached across the table to grab a napkin, his hand brushed mine again. This time, he didn't pull away. Instead, he held my hand, his thumb tracing small circles against my skin. My breath caught, but I didn't move. "Emma," he said softly, his eyes locking onto mine. I should have pulled away. I should have said something to stop it. But I didn't. The air between us thickened as he leaned in slightly. My heart raced, but before anything else could happen, my phone buzzed, Mike's name flashing on the screen. I jumped back, yanking my hand away as guilt flooded me. I need to get this," I stammered, grabbing my phone and walking out of the room. Jake stayed for another minute before leaving, but the tension he left behind lingered. And for the first time in years, I found myself wishing my husband wasn't coming home that night. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt Jake's touch, his thumb tracing my skin like it belonged there. I told myself it was harmless, just a moment of weakness. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I was still rattled when Jake texted me again. "Sorry if I crossed a line yesterday. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." Uncomfortable? No, that wasn't the word I'd use. Tempted, desperately tempted, that's what it was. "It's fine," I typed back. "Let's just forget about it." But Jake didn't let it go. "I can't forget it, Emma. And I don't think you can either." I stared at the message, my pulse quickening. He was right, I couldn't forget it. And instead of ignoring him like I should have, I found myself replying again. "Maybe we should talk." I told myself it was to set boundaries, to make sure it didn't happen again. But when he showed up that afternoon, the look in his eyes told me we weren't there to talk. He stepped inside, his presence filling the space. I could feel the tension between us, heavy and undeniable. "We need to stop this," I said, but my voice wavered. "Do we?" he asked, stepping closer. "Because I can't stop thinking about you, Emma." His words sent a shiver down my spine. My breath caught as he reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "You deserve more than being ignored," he whispered. Before I could respond, his hand brushed my cheek, and I leaned into his touch without thinking. It felt so natural, so right, even though I knew it was wrong. And then it happened. He kissed me. It wasn't gentle or hesitant. It was desperate, hungry, and I didn't stop him. My hands tangled in his hair as he pressed me against the counter, his body flush against mine. For the first time in years, I felt alive, desired. But as soon as it was over, reality hit me like a tidal wave. I pushed him away, my chest heaving. "This can't happen," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But even as I said the words, I knew it already had. And there was no going back. I spent the next few days avoiding Jake, and my own reflection. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw the same thing: guilt, shame, and a hunger I couldn't explain. I tried to throw myself into chores, errands, anything to distract myself. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop replaying that kiss. The way his hands felt on my skin. The way I didn't want it to end. Then Jake texted me again. "I can't stop thinking about you. Tell me you don't feel the same." I knew I should block his number, delete the messages, anything to create distance. But instead, my fingers hovered over the screen. "I don't know what I feel." His reply came instantly. "Then let me help you figure it out. I'll be there at 7. I should have told him no, but I didn't. Instead, I spent the next hour getting ready, changing outfits more times than I cared to admit. When the doorbell rang, my heart was already racing. Jake stepped inside, and the air felt heavier than before. His eyes scanned me, lingering on the curve of my hips, the neckline of my blouse. "You look incredible," he said, his voice low and full of something that sent heat rushing through me. I stepped back, trying to keep space between us. "Jake, we need to talk about this." But he didn't stop. He moved closer, his hand brushing my arm, sending shivers down my spine. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The way you looked at me, the way you felt in my arms." I opened my mouth to protest, but his lips found mine before I could speak. This time there was no hesitation. His hands moved down my back, pulling me closer until I could feel every inch of him. I should have stopped him. I should have said no. But instead, I let myself get lost in him. We stumbled toward the couch, his fingers sliding under my blouse, his touch igniting something inside me that I hadn't felt in years. "Jake, we can't," I breathed, even as my body betrayed me, arching into his touch. "Then tell me to stop," he whispered, his lips trailing down my neck. But I didn't. I couldn't. And as I gave in to him, I knew there was no turning back. The morning after was worse than I expected. I woke up tangled in guilt and regret, but the worst part was the way my body still ached for him. Jake had left before dawn, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of him on my skin and the memory of his touch. I stood in the shower, scrubbing myself raw, but no amount of soap could wash away what I had done. I avoided my phone all day, terrified of what his messages might say, or worse, what they wouldn't. But by evening, the silence was unbearable. And then, as if on cue, my phone lit up. "I need to see you again." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I knew what I should do: block his number, cut him off. But instead, I typed, "We can't. Last night was a mistake." His reply came almost instantly. It didn't feel like a mistake to me. I clenched my phone, my hands trembling. I hated how much I wanted him, how my body responded even to his words on a screen. A knock at the door snapped me out of my thoughts. My breath caught as I opened it, and there he was. "I couldn't stay away," Jake said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Jake, you can't just show up here," I whispered, glancing nervously toward the window. "I had to," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You're all I can think about, Emma. And I don't think I can stop." Before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, his hands cupping my face as he kissed me, desperate, hungry, and demanding. I pushed against his chest, trying to resist, but my resolve crumbled the moment his lips moved to my neck. My breath hitched, and my body betrayed me all over again. "Jake, we're crossing a line," I murmured, even as my fingers dug into his shoulders. "Then let's cross it," he whispered, lifting me effortlessly and carrying me to the couch. There was no hesitation this time, no second guessing. Clothes fell to the floor, and I lost myself in him completely. But when it was over, and the heat of the moment faded, reality came crashing down. I lay in his arms, staring at the ceiling, knowing there was no undoing what we'd done. Not this time. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to. I told myself it had to end, that this couldn't happen again. But when Jake texted me the next morning, my resolve disappeared as quickly as it came. I can't stop thinking about last night. I need to see you. I typed out a dozen replies, deleting each one until I finally settled on. We need to stop. But even as I hit send, my heart sank. I didn't want it to stop. Jake didn't reply right away, and the silence was unbearable. I paced the house, jumping every time my phone buzzed. And then, hours later, his name flashed across the screen. Meet me. One last time. We'll talk. I should have said no. I should have blocked him right then and there. Instead, I grabbed my keys and left. He was waiting at a motel just outside of town, his truck parked in the shadows. My stomach twisted as I walked toward the door, but when he opened it, all my doubts melted away. Emma, he breathed, pulling me inside before I could even speak. His hands were on me before the door shut, his lips crashing against mine with a hunger that stole my breath. I tried to resist, to push him away, but the heat between us was unbearable. Jake, we can't keep doing this, I whispered, even as I let him back me against the wall. Then tell me to stop, he said, his voice raw and desperate. I couldn't. His lips trailed down my neck, his hands sliding under my shirt, and I gave in again. Clothes fell to the floor, and soon we were tangled in the sheets, bodies pressed together like we'd been starving for each other. It was reckless. It was wrong. But it felt so good I didn't care. Afterward, I lay there, his arm draped over me as if he belonged there. For a moment, I let myself believe it could be real, that I could have this, have him. But reality hit hard when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was Mike, coming home early. Be there in an hour. Panic surged through me as I sat up, pulling away from Jake. I have to go, I said, scrambling to get dressed. Jake grabbed my arm. Don't do this. Don't run. I have to, I said, tears burning in my eyes. As I drove home, guilt clawed at me, but another feeling lingered, a dangerous, thrilling ache that refused to go away. I barely made it home before Mike walked through the door. My hair was still damp from the quick shower I took to wash away the scent of Jake, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it lingered. Mike greeted me with a distracted kiss on the cheek, already scrolling through his emails as he set his briefcase down. He didn't notice my flushed face or trembling hands. Dinner? He asked without looking up. Yeah, I'll get started. I forced myself to smile, to play the role of the devoted wife. But inside, I was unraveling. When Mike finally went upstairs to shower, my phone buzzed. Jake, I need to see you again. I should have deleted the message, but instead I typed, not now. Mike's home. His reply came instantly. And when he's not? The question hung in the air long after I set the phone down. Later that night, I lay in bed beside Mike, his steady breathing filling the silence. He reached for me, his touch mechanical, more habit than desire. I closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep until he gave up and rolled over. And all I could think about was Jake. The next day, I found myself parked outside the motel again, my heart pounding as I texted him. I'm here. Within seconds, Jake appeared, opening the door and pulling me inside before I could second-guess myself. I didn't think you'd come, he said, his voice low. I shouldn't have, I replied, but my words lacked conviction. He stepped closer, his eyes burning into mine. But you did. His hands were on me before I could respond, his lips claiming mine in a kiss that made my knees go weak. We didn't waste time this time. Clothes were shed quickly, and soon I was pressed against the wall, my body arching into his as heat consumed us. Every touch, every kiss made me forget everything else, my guilt, my fear, my husband. All I wanted was him. Afterward, as we lay tangled in each other, Jake brushed his fingers down my arm. Leave him, he whispered. I froze. What? Leave Mike. Be with me. My heart slammed in my chest. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come, because a part of me wanted to say yes. Jake's words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. Leave him. Be with me. I couldn't answer. My mind was spinning, torn between the life I had built with Mike and the fire I had found with Jake. I can't, I finally whispered, pulling away from him. His jaw tightened. Why not? You don't love him anymore. I can see it. I flinched at his words because deep down, I knew they were true. Whatever love I'd had for Mike had faded into routine and obligation. But leaving wasn't that simple. There's history, I said, my voice shaky. Commitments. A marriage. Jake stepped closer, his hands gripping my waist. You can't keep lying to yourself, Emma. You're not happy with him. I closed my eyes as his lips brushed my neck, igniting the same hunger that had consumed me before. I wanted to resist, but my body betrayed me. Jake, I breathed, but before I could finish, his mouth was on mine again, hot, urgent, and demanding. I melted into him, my hands tangled in his hair as he pushed me back onto the bed. My heart pounded as his lips trailed down my body, leaving a trail of heat in their wake. Every kiss, every touch made me forget who I was supposed to be. And for those stolen moments, I let myself be his. But when it was over, reality came crashing back. I sat up, clutching the sheet to my chest. This can't keep happening, I said, my voice breaking. Jake leaned back on his elbows, his gaze steady. Then end it. Walk away from him and start over. With me. Tears burned in my eyes. You don't understand. It's not that easy. Maybe it's not, he said softly, but you deserve more than this, Emma. And you know it. His words echoed in my mind as I drove home, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I walked through the door, Mike barely looked up from his laptop. Hey, he said. I'll be working late tonight. Don't wait up. I nodded, my stomach twisting with guilt, and something else. Because as wrong as it was, part of me was relieved. Relieved that he wouldn't be there. Relieved that I could see Jake again. And that terrified me. The next few days were a blur of guilt and longing. I tried to avoid Jake, but it was impossible. His texts came like clockwork, short, direct, and impossible to ignore. I need you. Every time his name lit up my screen, my heart skipped a beat. I told myself I wouldn't respond, but I always did. Tonight, that single word sealed my fate. I left the house before Mike even got home, using errands as an excuse. My stomach twisted with guilt, but my body was already aching for Jake. When I reached the motel, he was waiting outside, leaning against his truck. The way his eyes devoured me as I stepped out of the car sent a shiver down my spine. I barely made it through the door before his hands were on me, pulling me into him. This has to be the last time, I whispered, even as my fingers slid under his shirt. No, it doesn't, he said, his voice rough. You don't want it to be. I didn't. His lips crashed against mine, and I gave in completely. He lifted me, carrying me to the bed, his hands roaming my body like he couldn't get enough. Clothes fell away, and every touch, every kiss, pushed me further past the point of no return. His body pressed into mine, claiming me in ways that left me breathless and desperate for more. I knew I should stop. I knew this was wrong. But when he looked at me like I was the only woman in the world, I couldn't pull away. Afterward, we lay tangled in the sheets, the air thick with heat and unspoken words. Jake traced circles on my bare skin, his voice low. Stay with me tonight. Don't go back. I sat up, my heart pounding. I can't. Why not? His voice was sharp now, frustration bubbling to the surface. Because I'm married, Jake. To a man who doesn't even see you, he shot back. When are you going to stop pretending you're happy? I didn't have an answer. Jake pulled me back down, his lips brushing mine. You're mine, Emma. You know it. And the terrifying thing was, I did know it. But as I drove home later that night, the guilt finally caught up with me. I walked into the house and froze. Mike was sitting at the kitchen table, his face pale and his phone in his hand. Where were you? He asked, his voice calm. But the look in his eyes told me he already knew. Panic surged through me. My lips parted to speak, but no words came out. Because at that moment, I realized everything was about to fall apart. Mike's eyes locked onto mine, and my stomach dropped. Where were you, Emma? His voice was calm, too calm, but there was no mistaking the anger simmering beneath it. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My throat felt tight, like it was closing in on itself. Don't lie to me, he said, standing up slowly. I saw the texts. My heart stopped. Texts. He knew. I swallowed hard, my voice barely above a whisper. Mike, I can explain. Explain what? He snapped, slamming his phone down on the table. That you've been sneaking around with Jake? My best friend. Tears burned my eyes, but I didn't bother wiping them away. It wasn't supposed to happen, I choked out. I didn't plan this. But it did happen, he said, his voice breaking. Didn't it? I nodded, my shoulders shaking. I'm so sorry. He stared at me for what felt like forever, and the silence was unbearable. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Where are you going? I asked, panic rising. I don't know, he said without looking back. But I can't be here right now. The door slammed shut, and just like that, he was gone. I sank to the floor, sobbing, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I had destroyed my marriage. The next few days were agonizing. Mike didn't come home, and Jake's messages went unanswered. I couldn't face either of them. I hated myself for what I'd done, for letting things go so far. But at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about Jake, his touch, his words, the way he made me feel alive. When Mike finally came back, he didn't say much. He just packed a bag and told me he needed time. I didn't beg him to stay. I knew I had no right to. As the days turned into weeks, the silence became unbearable. I tried to focus on work, on rebuilding my life, but the emptiness lingered. And Jake, he kept reaching out, but I ignored him. I couldn't let myself go back down that road, not again. I wasn't sure what the future held. Maybe Mike would forgive me. Maybe he wouldn't. But one thing was certain, I would never be the same again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping stories like this. Stay tuned for more.